In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in one particular corner of the webway, there is a city where war is the least of your problems. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Commorragh, the Dark City, the place where the Drukhari do things to living souls that the Imperium doesn't have words for. And in the upper spire of a Cabal fortress, watching stolen light rise over razor-edged towers, there is a human. Not a slave, not in chains, dressed in finery, seated at the Archon's table, called by a name that rolls off the tongue like a blade drawn slowly across silk. His name is Kervon. He was taken as an infant from a burning world and raised as something between a pet and a masterpiece by creatures who experience love and cruelty as the same art form. He speaks their language, he thinks in their rhythms, he dreams in their city, and he loves it. That's the part that should disturb you. This is not a rescue story. There is no rescue coming. This is something stranger and darker and more human than that. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. They told me my name before they told me what I was. That is the first kindness I remember, if you could call it kindness. And I have spent every year since then trying to decide whether it was. Kervon. That is what she called me. Not a title, not a designation, not a number scratched into the flank of cattle. A name, Kervon. It rolls off the tongue like the edge of a blade drawn slowly across silk, which is, I think, exactly why she chose it. My mistress had an ear for the aesthetics of language, the way a sculptor has an eye for the angle of a cheekbone, and she would not have permitted anything graceless to exist in her court, least of all something she intended to keep for a very long time. I did not learn the word for what I was until I was perhaps 6 years old, measured in the cycles of a world I have never seen. Monkige, the gutter word, the nothing word. I heard it first from the lips of a Cabalite warrior who had too much venom wine in his blood and too little caution in his bearing. And when he said it, he was looking directly at me across the feasting hall with an expression I did not yet have the sophistication to interpret. Disgust, yes, that much was simple. But layered beneath it there was something else, something more complex and far more dangerous. Confusion. He could not understand why I was sitting at the table at all, why I was dressed in finery rather than in chains, why the Archon's own hand rested on my shoulder with something that, to his eyes, resembled affection. She killed him for it, of course. Not immediately. That would have been wasteful, and Mervis Kithelane was never wasteful. She waited 3 days, allowed the slight to ferment in the memory of every courtier who had witnessed it, and then she invited him to a private audience in the lower spire. What remained of him afterwards was displayed in the entrance gallery for a full turning of the false light, and it was exquisite work. I know that now. I understood it even then, in the wordless, instinctive way that a child understands the warmth of a fear or the sharpness of a fall. The Archon had defended my dignity, and in doing so she had made a statement that resonated through every corridor and alcove of the Cabal of the Hollow Blade. The Monkige belongs here. The Monkige is mine. Touch him and I will make poetry of your ruin. I loved her for it. I still love her for it. That is, I think, the most important thing you need to understand about me before I tell you anything else. I love the people who made me. I love them the way a river loves the canyon it has carved through over 1,000 years. Not because the canyon is beautiful, though it often is, but because the river cannot exist without it. The shape of me, every thought I think, and every reflex that fires in the sinew of my mind was carved by Commorragh. I am a product of this place. I breathe its air. I think in its language. I dream in the cadence of its cruelties. When I close my eyes and imagine safety, I do not see sunlit fields or the pale blue sky of some imperial world I have never known. I see the razor-edged spires of high Commorragh catching the stolen light of captive suns, and I see the silhouette of my mistress standing at the balcony of the Cithilene spire, looking down at the endless city with the quiet satisfaction of a predator surveying a hunting ground that has no horizon. That is what I am. A human being who calls Commorragh home. If you find that disturbing, I understand. I have been told it should disturb me too. It does not. Let me tell you how I came to be here, because the beginning of a thing always matters to the Drukhari, perhaps more than the thing itself. They are a people who understand that the preparation of a meal is often more pleasurable than the eating of it, and that the slow unwinding of a plot can sustain you longer than its resolution. My beginning is no exception. It has been told to me many times by many voices, each one adding their own embellishment, their own particular shade of cruelty or amusement, until the story of my arrival in the Dark City has become something between history and myth. I will tell you the version I was raised on, the version I believed for 36 years. Though in Commorragh, truth is a currency that devalues the moment it leaves your lips. I was taken from a world called Palingrath 4, an agri world, I am told, one of those vast, slow, pastoral planets that the Imperium cultivates like a fungus farm, feeding billions of identical mouths on billions of identical worlds with grain and livestock bred for quantity over quality. I have seen hololithic records of such places, captured during raids and stored in the archives of the Cabal, and they fill me with a sensation I can only describe as a species of vertigo. All that open sky, all that wasted space, fields stretching to a horizon that is not a wall, not a spire, not the curving edge of a stolen sub-realm stitched into the webway, but simply the place where the ground meets the sky and nothing happens. The thought of living beneath all that emptiness makes my skin tighten. I have heard humans describe the feeling of claustrophobia, the terror of enclosed spaces. I suffer from the opposite. I am afraid of too much room. The raid on Palingrath 4 was not a significant event by the standards of the Dark City. It was a mid-scale harvesting operation conducted jointly by the Cabal of the Hollow Blade and a lesser Cabal called the Cabal of the Drawn Vein, a minor power whose Archon at the time was seeking to improve his standing through an alliance with my mistress. The details of the raid itself are unremarkable. A webway portal was opened in the pre-dawn darkness of Palingrath's northern continent. Raiders and Venoms poured through in a shrieking tide, their splinter weapons cutting down the local planetary defense force before they could so much as sound an alarm. The harvest was generous. Thousands of humans were taken, herded into the holds of slave barges, like the livestock their world was built to produce. Standard practice, efficient, elegant in its simplicity. I was among the taken, though I was not herded anywhere. I was carried. An infant, perhaps 8 months old by human reckoning, pulled from a burning settlement by a Cabalite warrior of the Drawn Vein, who found me in the wreckage of a HAB unit that had been struck by a stray dark light blast. I am told I was not crying, which apparently struck the warrior as unusual. Most human infants, when surrounded by fire and the screams of the dying, tend to express their displeasure quite vocally. I, according to the story, simply stared up at the warrior's masked face with wide, silent eyes and reached for the curved blade at his hip with the unthinking curiosity of a child who does not yet understand what a weapon is. The warrior brought me to his Archon, the Lord of the Drawn Vein, who examined me with the clinical disinterest of a man inspecting a piece of merchandise he had not ordered. I was healthy. I was quiet. I was, by the standards of Monkige infants, apparently somewhat aesthetically tolerable, which among the Drukhari is the highest compliment a human can hope to receive. The Archon of the Drawn Vein saw an opportunity, or so the story goes. I know better now, but I will tell you the version I was raised on, the version that everyone in the court believed, because understanding the lie is the only way to understand how thoroughly the truth destroyed it. He was, at that time, in the process of negotiating a more permanent alliance with Mayor Vice Keithalain, and he needed a gift. Not a gift of weapons or slaves or territory, because those gifts carry expectations of reciprocity. He needed something novel, something that would amuse her, catch her attention, demonstrate the creativity of his thinking. A curiosity. So he gave her me. I am told that when the Archon of the Drawn Vein presented me to Marvis in the reception hall of the Keithalain Spire, she did not react immediately. She studied me for a long time, this tiny, fragile, impossibly short-lived creature swaddled in a makeshift wrapping of flayed leather, and she said nothing. The courtiers who witnessed the moment expected her to laugh, or to hand me off to a servant for disposal, or perhaps to toss me to one of the clawed fiends she kept as pets in the lower kennels. Instead, she reached out and took me from the Archon's hands, and she held me, and she looked at me with an expression that 3 separate witnesses have described to me using 3 different words. The first said she looked intrigued. The second said she looked hungry. The third, a very old rack in the service of the homunculus Gesric, who was present that day on what I was told was unrelated business, though I have since learned that nothing involving Gesric was ever unrelated to anything, said she looked like a woman who had just been given exactly what she did not know she wanted. That is where my story begins. In the arms of an Archon, in the heart of the Dark City, in a place that no human being should ever call home. I was raised in the Keithalain Spire, which is the ancestral seat of Mervis's power within the cable of the Hollow Blade. I use the word ancestral loosely, of course, because the Drukhari do not think of ancestry the way humans apparently do. There are no warm family portraits hanging on the walls, no fond recollections of grandparents and childhood homes. The Keithalain Spire has changed hands 17 times in the last 4,000 years, each transition marked by the violent death of its previous occupant and the installation of a new regime built on the bones of the old. Marvis herself took the spire from an Archon named Drethel Vorenthi, whose flayed skin she wore as a cloak for the first century of her reign, before it deteriorated beyond aesthetic usefulness. That is what ancestry means in Commorragh. It is not a line of descent, it is a chain of conquest, and every link is forged in blood. My earliest memories are of the spire, not the grand halls or the audience chambers or the trophy galleries that visiting Archons and succubi would see when they came to pay their respects. My earliest memories are of the private quarters in the upper reaches, where the stolen light of a captive sun filtered through crystalline walls that had been grown, not built, their molecular structure coaxed into being over centuries, by techniques that the Imperium could not replicate if it devoted every forge world in its domain to the task. I remember the warmth of that light, which was not the warmth of any natural star, but something thinner, more precise, as if the light itself had been refined and purified until only its most pleasing qualities remained. I remember the sound of the spire, which was never silent. There was always a low hum, a vibration that I later learned was the resonance of the anti-gravitational field generators that kept the upper levels suspended above the streets of High Commorragh. And beneath that hum there was something else, something deeper and more rhythmic, like a heartbeat felt through the floor. I did not know it then, but that was the sound of the flesh engines in the lower levels, the grotesque mechanisms that powered the spire's defenses with the psychic agony of living fuel. I remember hands, not human hands, though I did not understand the difference yet. Drukhari hands are longer than human hands, the fingers thinner, the joints more articulate, and their skin has a quality that I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone who has not touched it. It is smoother than human skin, almost frictionless, as though the surface has been polished at a molecular level, and yet it is warm, warmer than you would expect, warmer than the temperature of the air around it, because the Drukhari run hotter than humans in ways that are not entirely physical. There were many hands in my early life, servants who fed me, dressed me, cleaned me, carried me from room to room with a care that was motivated less by affection and more by the knowledge that damaging the Archon's property would result in consequences that made death look like a holiday. But the hands I remember best are hers, Mervise's. She held me often in those early years, which I have been told was unusual for an Archon of her stature and temperament. Drukhari do not typically involve themselves in the rearing of children, even their own. True-born offspring are raised by servants and tutors, and the occasional homunculus who has been contracted to ensure the child's physical development meets the exacting standards of Commorragh aristocracy. For an Archon to personally attend to the care of a Monkij infant was, by the standards of the Cabal, somewhere between eccentric and insane. It generated whispers, it generated theories, it generated, in at least 2 cases that I know of, assassination attempts against me by courtiers who feared that the Archon's attachment to her pet was a sign of weakness that could be exploited. Those courtiers are dead now. Their remains were incorporated into a decorative screen in the 3rd-level antechamber. I pass it every day. It is, I am told, considered one of the finer pieces of interior design in the spire. I have learned not to think too hard about the fact that my childhood home is decorated with the people who tried to kill me as a baby. In Commorragh, this is not considered unusual. It is considered good taste. What I want you to understand is that I was not raised in a cage. I was not chained in a dungeon, or starved, or beaten, or subjected to the casual and systematic brutality that defines the existence of most human slaves in Commorragh. I was raised in the heart of the court among the Drukhari themselves, and I was treated with a degree of consideration that would have been remarkable even for a true-born child of noble lineage. I had tutors. I had training. I had a place at the Archon's table and a room in the upper spire that was larger and more beautifully appointed than anything a planetary governor in the Imperium could hope to possess. I was given gifts on the anniversary of my arrival, which the court observed with a celebration that was half genuine festivity and half elaborate performance designed to reinforce the Archon's reputation for unpredictability and extravagance. I was, by any measure that the Drukhari would recognize, privileged, and I was happy. I need you to hear that. I was happy. Not in the way that a slave is happy when the lash does not fall, or in the way that a prisoner is happy when the cell door opens for an hour of exercise. I was happy the way a child is happy when it is surrounded by everything it knows and loves, when the boundaries of its world are exactly the right size, and every face within those boundaries is familiar. Commorragh was not a prison to me. It was the world. The only world. The gleaming, razor-sharp, magnificently terrible world, and I belonged to it as completely as any Drukhari born within its spires. That is either the saddest thing I have ever said, or the truest. I have not yet decided which. I learned to speak before I learned to walk, which is apparently the reverse of the typical human developmental sequence. My tutors attributed this to the linguistic environment of the spire, where language is not merely a tool of communication, but a weapon, a performance, and an art form all at once. The Drukhari tongue is not a single language. It is a layered system of overlapping registers, each one suited to a different context, a different audience, a different intention. There is the high tongue, which is used in formal address and courtly speech, and which shares roots with the language of the craft world Eldari that the Drukhari left behind millennia ago. There is the low tongue, which is spoken in the fighting pits and the slave markets and the narrow streets of Low Commorragh, where the dregs of the dark city scrape out their existence in the shadows of the great spires. There is the silent tongue, which is not spoken at all but communicated through gesture, posture, the angle of a turned wrist, the precise duration of eye contact, and which carries more information in a single raised finger than a paragraph of spoken words. And then there is the poison tongue, which has no formal grammar and no fixed vocabulary, because it is the language of insult, of insinuation, of the slow verbal dismemberment that the Drukhari practice on each other, the way humans apparently practice small talk. I learned this one last, and I learned it the hardest way possible, which is to say, I learned it by being its target. A child in the court of an Archon, even a favored child, even a child protected by the Archon's explicit displeasure at mistreatment, is still a child surrounded by predators. The Drukhari do not soften their behavior for the young. They do not lower their voices or moderate their cruelties or pretend that the world is a gentler place than it is. A Drukhari child is expected to navigate the full spectrum of Commorragh social interaction from the moment it can comprehend language, and if it fails, if it is wounded by a barb it was too slow to deflect, that is considered a valuable lesson. Pain is instructive. This is not a philosophy in Commorragh. It is a law of nature. My first tutor was a half-born named Kelvassian, a thin and angular Drukhari with eyes the color of bruised twilight, and a voice that could make the recitation of a supply manifest sound like a death threat. She had been assigned to my education by the Archon's court administrator, a thankless task that she accepted with the same cold professionalism that she applied to everything in her life. Kelvassian did not like me. She did not dislike me either. She regarded me with the detached curiosity of a scholar studying an insect that has unexpectedly survived a laboratory experiment, and she taught me with a thoroughness that I only later understood was motivated by fear. If the Archon's pet failed to meet expectations, the Archon would look for someone to blame, and the tutor is always the first candidate. So Kelvassian taught me, and she taught me well. I learned the high tongue first, its flowing vowels and knife-sharp consonants, its elaborate system of honorifics, and its even more elaborate system of veiled threats disguised as compliments. I learned the histories of the Drukhari, not as dry chronicles of dates and events, but as living narratives of betrayal and ambition and revenge that stretched back to the fall of the Eldari and the birth of the god that eternally hungers for their souls. I learned about She Who Thirsts, the great devourer in the warp, the reason for everything, the reason the Drukhari fled into the webway, the reason they built Commorragh, the reason they raid and they torture and they feed on the suffering of others, because without that sustenance their souls would wither and be consumed, slowly and agonizingly, by a god that they created with their own excess and that will never, ever stop being hungry. I remember the day Kelvassian explained this to me. I was perhaps 4 years old, sitting cross-legged on a floor of polished bone in the education chamber, and she was standing at the far end of the room with her hands clasped behind her back and her expression arranged in its customary mask of professional indifference. She told me about the fall in the same tone she used to describe the proper conjugation of verbs in the formal register, and when she reached the part about Slaanesh, about the moment of its birth and the psychic scream that tore through the galaxy and devoured the souls of billions of Eldari in a single instant of catastrophic ecstasy, she paused and looked at me and said something that I have never forgotten. She said that the Drukhari are a people defined by a single choice they made 10,000 years ago, which was to survive at any cost, and that every act of cruelty, every slave taken, every scream harvested and consumed is a consequence of that choice. She said that if I wanted to understand the Drukhari, I should not look at what they do. I should look at what is chasing them. I think about that often. The thing behind the curtain, the hunger that has no face and no end. Every Drukhari carries it with them, this awareness of the abyss at their backs, and it shapes everything they do. Their cruelty is not random. It is not recreational, though they have refined it into something that resembles recreation in the same sense that a fortification wall resembles architecture. It is survival. It is the desperate, elegant, endlessly inventive survival of a species that has no choice but to feed or die, and that has chosen to feed so magnificently, so extravagantly, so artistically, that the feeding itself has become the defining characteristic of their civilization. I understood this before I understood what it meant to be human. I understood the hunger before I understood that I was supposed to be the food. My physical education began when I was approximately 5 years old, and it was here that the realities of my biology became impossible to ignore. I was, by every measurable metric, inferior. Slower, weaker, clumsier, duller of reflex, shorter of reach, and possessed of a sensory apparatus so primitive that the Drukhari equivalent would be considered a severe disability. My tutors were patient after their fashion, which is to say they did not kill me when I failed, though they made it abundantly clear through expression and tone that my failures were a source of profound aesthetic displeasure. A Drukhari child of equivalent age would have been 3 times faster, 5 times more coordinated, and already capable of the basic combat forms that are taught to all members of the Cabal from the moment they can hold a blade. I could barely hold a blade. My fingers were too short, my grip too weak, my understanding of balance and leverage, and the geometry of violence so rudimentary that my first combat instructor, a scarred Kabbalite named Thravin, told me that teaching me to fight was like teaching a grox to dance. Theoretically possible, he said, but aesthetically indefensible. I trained anyway. I trained because it was expected, because the Archon wished it, because in Commorragh you are either useful or you are decoration, and decoration has a limited shelf life. I would never be fast enough to match a Drukhari in single combat. I would never have the reflexes to dodge a splinter round, or the agility to ride a Hellion skyboard through the narrow canyons between the spires. But I could be competent. I could be functional. I could learn to move through the world without embarrassing my mistress, and in Commorragh, not being an embarrassment is the first step toward not being dead. Thravin was my primary combat instructor for the first several years of my training, and he taught me the fundamentals of Drukhari close-quarters fighting, adapted with considerable reluctance to the limitations of my human physiology. Where a Drukhari would rely on speed and precision, I was taught to rely on positioning and anticipation. Where a Drukhari would strike 6 times in the span of a heartbeat, I was taught to strike once, at the right moment, in the right place, with everything I had. Thravin called this approach the doctrine of the single wound, and he told me that it was not a Drukhari fighting philosophy at all, but something he had improvised specifically for me, because no existing school of Drukhari combat had ever needed to account for a student who moved as though gravity had a personal vendetta against him. I took the insult as instruction, which is the correct response to almost everything in Commorragh. Thravin once told me that the difference between an insult and a lesson is the direction of the blade. And since in Commorragh most blades point at you regardless of the speaker's intent, you might as well learn something on the way to the medical bay. It was during this period that I first became aware of the arenas, though I did not attend one in person until I was much older. The arenas are the beating heart of Commorragh society, the great cathedrals of spectacle where the witch cults perform their art, and the citizens of the Dark City gather to feed on the collective suffering of the combatants. I heard them before I saw them, from the upper levels of the Cothelin Spire, on still days when the false winds that circulate through the upper reaches of the Webway Pocket died down. You could hear the roar of the crowd. Not words, not individual voices, but a sound like a tide, a vast and rhythmic exhalation of hunger and satisfaction that rolled across the spires of High Commorragh and settled into the bones of the city like the echo of a drum. I asked Kelvassian what the sound was, and she told me it was the sound of the city being fed. I was fascinated. Terrified and fascinated, which is, I have learned, the only appropriate emotional response to anything of significance in Commorragh. The arenas were spoken of in the court the way I imagine humans speak of their cathedrals, with a reverence that transcended mere entertainment. They were sacred in the way that a killing ground can be sacred, and the witches who fought in them were regarded with a mixture of admiration and desire that bordered on worship. I wanted to see them. I wanted to understand what it felt like to be in the presence of that sound, that tide of collective hunger, and to watch as the finest warriors in the Dark City turned the ending of lives into something that the Drukhari called art. Mervis took me to my first arena spectacle when I was 9 years old. It was a mid-tier event, she explained. Not one of the great festivals that drew the attention of the entire Dark City, but respectable enough that she would not be seen as slumming. We traveled by personal transport, a sleek anti-grav craft that cut through the corridors of High Commorragh like a blade through water. And I remember pressing my face to the crystalline viewport and staring at the city as it flowed past beneath us. I had seen Commorragh from the spire, of course, but seeing it from above in motion was something else entirely. The scale of it, the impossible, vertiginous, brain-breaking scale of a city that was not a city, but a dimension. A pocket universe of razor-edged architecture and borrowed radiance that extended in every direction without end. Spires taller than mountains, chasms deeper than oceans, bridges of solidified darkness spanning gaps between districts that were, in real space terms, thousands of light years apart. I felt a sensation that I did not yet have a word for, a swelling pressure behind my sternum that was equal parts awe and terror and belonging, and I think that was the moment I first understood that I was in love with this place, not in the way a prisoner loves their cell because they have never known anything else. In the way a native loves their homeland because the shape of it is written in their soul. The arena itself was a structure called the Crucible of the Bleeding Grace, owned and operated by the witch cult of the same name. It was not the largest arena in Commorragh, not by a considerable margin, but it was old, and in the Dark City, age confers a certain prestige that mere size cannot match. The Crucible was a vast, tiered amphitheater carved into the inner face of a hollow spire, its walls lined with observation platforms and private balconies from which the elite of High Commorragh could watch the spectacles in relative comfort while their inferiors crowded the open tiers below, pressed together in a mass of pale flesh and dark armor and shining, hungry eyes. Mervis had a private balcony, of course. An archon of her standing would not be seen among the common audience, and the balcony itself was a statement of status, its position in the upper reaches of the arena indicating the cobble's relationship with the cult of the Bleeding Grace, which was, at that time, cordial but cautious. She sat me beside her, not behind her as a slave would have been positioned, not at her feet as a pet might have been, but beside her in a seat of equal elevation where I could be seen by anyone who cared to look in her direction. This was deliberate. Everything Mervis did was deliberate. She was showing me off, and she was showing the court that she was showing me off, and she was watching their reactions with the same keen attention that she would later bring to the spectacle in the arena below. The first bout was a warm-up, a minor engagement between a pair of witch initiates and a collection of captured orcs that had been starved and maddened in the pits below the arena until they were little more than green-skinned engines of mindless fury. The witches carved through them with a fluid, dancing grace that made the violence look choreographed, though I later learned that the lack of choreography was precisely the point. Witch combat is improvisation. It is the art of responding to chaos with beauty, of finding the aesthetic in the unpredictable, and the best witches are those who can make the death of a screaming alien look like a stanza of poetry composed in the moment of its utterance. I watched everything, and I felt the arena do something to me that I was not prepared for. The crowd was feeding, I knew that much. They were absorbing the psychic residue of the suffering below, drawing it into themselves like roots pulling water from deep soil, and the collective effect of thousands of Drukhari feeding simultaneously produced an atmosphere that was almost physical. A pressure, a warmth, a resonance that vibrated in the air and in the floor and in the marrow of my bones. I could not feed on it the way they could. I do not have the psychic architecture for it. My soul is a dim and flickering thing by Drukhari standards, a candle in a room full of bonfires. But I could feel it. I could feel the edges of it, the way you can feel the warmth of a fire even if you are standing too far away to see the flames. And what I felt was not revulsion. It was belonging. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I know. A human child sitting in an arena built for the glorification of suffering, feeling a sense of belonging while warriors are torn apart for the entertainment of a species that considers his kind to be livestock. It should be horrifying. It is horrifying when I examine it with the part of my mind that has learned, over many years, to see myself through the eyes of the species I was born into. But that part of my mind is small and quiet and perpetually outvoted by the rest of me, which is Drukhari in every way that matters except the biological, and which felt, in that arena, surrounded by the sound and the fury and the dark, electric joy of the feeding crowd, that it had finally found the place where it was supposed to be. Mervis watched me watching the arena, and she smiled. It was a small smile, barely a motion of the lips, and it carried within it a complexity of emotion that I would spend years learning to interpret. Satisfaction, vindication, and something else, something that, at the time, I mistook for pride. I did not know that the homunculus was watching too. I would not learn that for a very long time. The homunculus Gesric entered my life when I was 11, though entered is perhaps the wrong word for someone who had been standing in the room the entire time and simply chose that moment to step out of the shadow. I later discovered he had been present in it since the very beginning, since before the very beginning, since before I was even born. He simply had not chosen to make himself known until then, preferring to observe from a distance, to study, to take notes in the clinical and meticulous manner that is the hallmark of his kind. When he finally did introduce himself, it was not through the formal channels of Commorragh etiquette, but through a summons delivered to my quarters in the middle of the sleep cycle, written on a strip of skin so thin and pale that I initially mistook it for parchment. It was not parchment. The message was brief and characteristically devoid of pleasantry. It said that the master homunculus Gesric of the Coven of the Flensed Choir had requested my presence in his laboratory at the base of the Caithelane spire, and that the request had been approved by the Archon, and that I should come immediately and bring nothing with me that I valued. I went. Not because I was brave, but because in Commorragh, a summons from a homunculus is not a request. It is a statement of intent that has been dressed up in the clothing of politeness, and the only thing that refusing accomplishes is to make the subsequent experience more unpleasant than it would have been if you had cooperated. The laboratory of Gesrik was located in the sublevels of the spire, in a region that I had been told since childhood was off limits. I had never questioned this restriction. The lower levels of any Drukhari spire are the domain of things that serve but are not served, machines and organisms and hybrid constructions that blur the line between the two until the distinction becomes meaningless. The air down there was different, thicker. It carried a sweetness that was not pleasant, the kind of sweetness that comes from organic material in a state of transformation. Not decay exactly, but not growth either. Something between, something that had no equivalent in the clean, precisely climate-controlled atmosphere of the upper spire. Gesrik's laboratory was not what I expected. I had imagined something out of the stories I had been told about the Homunculi, a dungeon of horrors, a charnel house of screaming victims and writhing flesh constructs and walls, slick with the residue of unspeakable experiments. What I found instead was a space of extraordinary order and precision. Every surface was clean, every instrument was arranged with geometric exactitude. The light was steady and clear, a cool white that revealed every detail without shadow, and the temperature was perfectly calibrated to a degree of comfort that made the upper spire feel crude by comparison. There were specimens, yes, things in jars and tanks and suspension fields that I did not look at too closely, not because I was frightened, but because I understood, with the instinct of a child raised among predators, that looking too closely at a homunculus's collection was an invitation to become part of it. Gesrik himself was tall, even by Drukhari standards, and thin in a way that was less emaciated and more distilled, as though everything unnecessary had been removed from his frame, and what remained was pure function. His face was ancient and ageless at the same time, the skin drawn tight across bones that had been restructured so many times that they no longer resembled anything that nature had designed. His eyes were the most striking feature. They were not the usual dark, depthless eyes of the Drukhari, but something altered, something that glowed faintly with a bioluminescent light that shifted colors depending on his angle of focus. And when those eyes turned on me, I felt, for the first time in my life, genuinely seen. Not in the way Mayavis saw me, as a possession, a curiosity, a statement of power. Gesrik saw me the way a craftsman sees raw material. He was looking at what I was, and he was already imagining what I could become. He did not speak to me that first visit. He measured me. He took samples of my blood, my skin, my saliva, my tears, with instruments so fine and so quick that I barely felt their touch. He scanned me with devices that hummed and clicked and projected hololithic images of my internal anatomy into the air around us, rotating them, zooming in, examining every organ and every bone and every meter of nerve fiber with an attention to detail that was almost loving. When he was finished, he sat back on his instrument stool and regarded me for a long time in silence, those shifting eyes moving across my face like searchlights across a battlefield. And then he said a single word: promising. That was the beginning of my relationship with the coven of the Flensed Choir, and it was the beginning of the process that would transform me from a fragile, short-lived, biologically inferior specimen of humanity into something that could survive in Commorragh, not merely as a curiosity, but as a functional entity with a projected lifespan that Gesrik described, with characteristic understatement, as not entirely disappointing. The modifications began gradually. Gesrik was not the kind of homunculus who operated in grand, dramatic strokes. He was a patient craftsman, a methodical artist who understood that the best work is done slowly, over time, in increments so small that the subject barely notices the change until they look back and realize that they are no longer what they were. The first modifications were structural, beginning with my skeletal system. I remember the session vividly, not because of the pain, which came later, but because of the sound. A low, resonant hum that I could feel in my teeth as the bonding compound was introduced to the marrow of my bones, fusing with the existing tissue at a molecular level, thickening it, hardening it, transforming the fragile calcium architecture of a human child into something that could survive a fall that would have shattered an unmodified skeleton like glass. I lay on Gezrik's operating platform for 3 days while the compound set, drifting in and out of a chemical twilight that was not quite sleep and not quite waking. And when I stood up on the 4th day, I felt heavier and lighter at the same time, as though the weight of my body had been redistributed according to principles that my original design had not accounted for. My joints were reworked next, the cartilage replaced with a synthetic analog that would not degrade over time. My cardiovascular system was optimized, my lungs expanded, my blood chemistry altered to carry more oxygen and process toxins more efficiently. None of this was done for my comfort. I want to be clear about that. Gezrik was not motivated by compassion or by any concern for my well-being as an individual. He was solving a problem. The problem was that I was human, and humans are, from a Drukhari engineering perspective, catastrophically fragile. We break too easily. We age too quickly. We succumb to diseases that a Drukhari immune system would destroy without even noticing. And our organs fail in ways that the homunculi find not just inconvenient, but aesthetically offensive. Gezrik's modifications were designed to address these deficiencies, to extend my useful lifespan, and increase my physical durability to a level that he considered minimally acceptable for a being that was expected to exist in close proximity to Drukhari society, without being accidentally killed by a stiff breeze or a minor environmental fluctuation. The pain was considerable. I will not pretend otherwise. Gezrik was a master of his craft, and he could have made the procedures painless if he had wished, because the technology at his disposal was more than capable of eliminating physical discomfort entirely. He did not wish. Pain, he explained to me during one of our sessions, is information. It is the body's method of communicating its state to the conscious mind, and to eliminate it entirely is to blind yourself to the most honest signal your own flesh can produce. He allowed me enough pain to learn from, and not enough to overwhelm, and in this he demonstrated a precision of calibration that I have seen him apply to nothing else in his work. Most of his subjects, I would later learn, received no such consideration. They received as much pain as the procedure generated, or more, depending on Gezrik's mood and the specific nature of his experiment. I was different. I was always different, though I did not understand why until much later. The modifications continued over several years, each one building on the last, each one pushing me slightly further from the human baseline and slightly closer to something that could hold its own in the lethal environment of the Dark City. My senses were sharpened, not to Drukhari levels, which would have been biologically impossible without replacing my nervous system entirely, but to a degree that placed me well above the capabilities of an unmodified human. My reflexes were accelerated. My capacity for physical recovery was enhanced. By the time Gezrik declared the initial phase of his work complete, I was perhaps 15 years old, and I was, by human standards, extraordinary. Faster, stronger, tougher, sharper than any unmodified human had a right to be, capable of feats that would have impressed even the most demanding of imperial military trainers. By Drukhari standards, I was still hopelessly inadequate, but I was alive, and I was functional, and I was improving. And in Commorragh, improvement is the only currency that never devalues. I once asked Gesric whether, after all his modifications, I could be considered something more than baseline human. He looked at me with those color-shifting eyes and said that I had been elevated from the category of insect to the category of small mammal. I chose to interpret this as a compliment, which tells you everything you need to know about the state of my expectations. It was around this time that I had my first genuine encounter with other human beings, and it nearly broke me. I had seen humans before, of course. You cannot live in Commorragh without seeing humans. They are everywhere, in the slave markets and the work camps and the fighting pits and the streets of Low Commorragh, where they are driven in coffles by Kabbalite overseers to whatever destination requires their labor or their pain. I had seen them from the windows of the spire, distant figures in chains, and I had seen them in the arenas, dying for the entertainment of the crowd, and I had seen them in the trophy galleries of the Caithalane spire, preserved in various states of artistic rearrangement that demonstrated Mervis's taste for the Baroque. But I had never spoken to one. I had never been close enough to touch one. I had never looked into the face of a creature that shared my species and tried to find something of myself reflected in its eyes. The encounter was not planned. I was in the lower market district on an errand for one of the court administrators, a task that took me through a section of Commorragh that I did not normally visit, and I passed a holding pen where a recently arrived shipment of slaves was being processed for distribution. They were from an imperial world, I could tell that much, from the tattered remnants of their clothing, which bore the faded insignia of some Astra Militarum regiment or another. There were perhaps 40 of them, men and women and a handful of children, crammed into a cage of dark light-reinforced bars that crackled with a faint violet energy whenever someone touched them. They were filthy. They were wounded. They were terrified in a way that went beyond simple fear and into a territory of absolute, soul-deep incomprehension. They did not understand where they were. They did not understand what was happening to them. They did not understand what they were for. I stopped. I should not have stopped. Stopping in the market district to stare at a cage of slaves is, at best, a sign of vulgar curiosity unbecoming of someone attached to an archon's court, and at worst, a potential security risk. But I stopped, and I looked at them, and they looked at me. And the expression on their faces when they saw me was something that I carry with me to this day. A wound that Gesric's modifications cannot touch because it is not in my body. It is somewhere deeper. They looked at me with hope. They saw a human face in this place of horrors, and they thought for one bright and terrible moment that help had arrived, that I was a rescuer, that I was one of them. A man at the front of the cage pressed himself against the bars and spoke to me in a language I barely recognized, guttural and harsh and full of hard consonants. And it took me several seconds to realize that he was speaking Low Gothic, the common tongue of the Imperium of Man, and that he was begging me to help them, to tell them where they were, to tell them what was going to happen to them, to tell them, please, in the name of the Emperor, that there was a way out. I understood enough of his words to piece together the meaning, though Low Gothic was a language I had studied only academically as a tactical intelligence tool, and hearing it spoken by a living human being was a disorienting experience. The sounds were ugly to my ear, flat and graceless compared to the liquid precision of the Drukhari tongue, and the emotional register was overwhelming. Humans wear their feelings on the outside, I have noticed. They broadcast them through their voices and their faces, and their posture with a profligacy that the Drukhari find almost indecent, like a person who walks through a dangerous street, counting their money aloud. This man was broadcasting terror and hope in equal measure, and both of those signals hit me with a force that I was not prepared for. Because for all my Drukhari education and all my carefully cultivated detachment, I was still, at the biological level, a creature wired to respond to the distress of its own kind. I did not help them. I want you to understand that I considered it in the same way that a person standing at the edge of a cliff considers jumping, as a brief, vertiginous impulse that is immediately overridden by the understanding that the action would accomplish nothing except the ending of the actor. There was no help to give. There was no way out. There was no rescue coming. These people were stock, and they would be processed and distributed and consumed in accordance with the economics of the Dark City, and nothing I said or did would change that. If I had freed them from the cage, which I could not have done even if I had wanted to, because the locks were keyed to Kabbalite biorhythms that I did not possess, they would have been recaptured within minutes, and their punishment would have been creative and prolonged, and my punishment for enabling their escape would have been worse. So I did what any Drukhari would have done in my position. I walked away. But the man's voice followed me. He shouted after me in that graceless, heartbreaking language, and the word he used, the last word I heard before I turned a corner and put enough distance between us to muffle the sound, was a word that I did not need a translator to understand. He called me a traitor. He called me a traitor because I looked like him, and I dressed like them, and I walked free while he was in a cage, and in his mind that made me complicit in everything that had been done, and everything that would be done, and everything that the Dark City represented. He was right, of course. He was absolutely right. I am complicit. I have always been complicit. I was born into complicity like a fish born into water, and I have spent my entire life swimming in it. And the fact that I did not choose the water does not mean I am not wet. That encounter changed something in me, though it took years for me to understand what. It did not make me sympathize with humans. It did not awaken some dormant sense of species loyalty or trigger a crisis of identity that made me question my place in Commorragh society. What it did was make me aware, for the first time, that I occupied a position that had no name and no precedent. I was not Drukhari. I was not human. Not in any meaningful cultural sense. I was something else entirely, something that existed in the space between two species and belonged fully to neither. And this position, this unique and unprecedented vantage point, was both my greatest asset and the source of a loneliness so profound that I sometimes felt it as a physical sensation, a hollowness in the chest that no amount of feeding could fill, because I was not built to feed at all. Mervis, whose understanding of the architecture of ambition rivaled any homunculus's understanding of the architecture of flesh, saw my position as an opportunity. She had been cultivating relationships with the cult of the Bleeding Grace for some time, using the standard diplomatic tools of Commorragh politics, which is to say a precise mixture of flattery, threat, trade agreements, and the occasional strategically timed assassination of mutual enemies. The cult's succubus at the time, a creature of extraordinary beauty and equally extraordinary lethality named Estriach Drenvaleth, had expressed a mild interest in my existence during a social function at the Keithaline Spire, and Mervis, seizing on this with the instinct of a raptor catching an updraft, proposed an arrangement. I would be permitted to train with the cult for a period of time, learning from their weapon masters and their dance instructors, and in return the Archon would provide the cult with preferential access to the slave stock from her next 3 raids. It was a transaction dressed up as a favor, which is the only kind of favor that exists in Commorragh. My training with the cult of the Bleeding Grace began when I was 16, and it was, without qualification, the most physically punishing experience of my life up to that point, and I include in that assessment every session I had endured in Grimdark's laboratory. The witches trained differently from the Kabbalites. where the Kabbalite combat style was functional and efficient, designed to kill quickly and reliably in the context of real space raids, the Witch style was performative. It was combat as art, violence as self-expression, and every movement, every strike, every evasion and counter and finishing blow was evaluated not just on its tactical effectiveness, but on its aesthetic quality. A witch who killed efficiently but gracelessly was considered a failure. A witch who died beautifully was, in certain circles, considered a success. This inversion of the survival instinct was, I discovered, not as alien to my way of thinking as it should have been. I had been raised among the Drukhari. I understood that beauty was a form of power, that elegance was a kind of weapon, and that the way a thing was done mattered as much as, and sometimes more than, the thing itself. My primary instructor in the cult was a hecatrix named Sorvathi, a veteran of more arena bouts than she cared to count, and one of the few members of the cult who did not regard my presence as an insult to the art form. Sorvathi was pragmatic in a way that was unusual for a witch. She did not care about my species. She cared about whether I could move, and I could move. Not well, not by witch standards, but Gezrik's modifications had given me a baseline of physical capability that was, Sorvathi admitted after watching me for the first time, not entirely hopeless. She said this in the same tone that a master sculptor might use when examining a block of stone that was not marble, but might, with enough effort, pass for something acceptable at a distance. High praise by her standards. Sorvathi taught me the fundamentals of witch combat, the fluid, dance-like movement patterns that allowed a fighter to maintain constant motion while simultaneously tracking multiple threats and identifying openings. She taught me to use my body's momentum as a weapon, to redirect force rather than meet it head-on, to turn an opponent's aggression against them with a pivot and a blade placed precisely where their balance was most vulnerable. She taught me to read the arena, to understand the three-dimensional geometry of a combat space, and to use its features, its elevation changes, and its obstacles, and its sightlines as extensions of my own combat capability. And she taught me something that no one else in Commorragh had thought to teach me, which was that my humanity was not only a disadvantage. Humans are unpredictable, she told me. Not in the way that orcs are unpredictable, which is the unpredictability of simple chaos, but in a subtler and more dangerous way. Humans operate on emotional logic that the Drukhari find difficult to model, because the Drukhari, for all their emotional intensity, are fundamentally rational in their cruelty. A Drukhari will always act in their own interest. A Drukhari will always choose survival over sentiment, advantage over loyalty, elegance over brute effectiveness. Humans do not always do this. Humans are capable of acting against their own interest, of making decisions that are irrational by any objective measure, driven by emotions that the Drukhari experience differently or not at all. Love, grief, guilt, loyalty that persists beyond the point of utility. These are liabilities in the context of Commorragh society, but in the context of a fight, they can be assets, because an opponent who cannot predict your behavior cannot prepare for it, and an opponent who cannot prepare for your behavior is an opponent who is already losing. She called this the Monkey advantage, and she said it with a thin smile that suggested she found the concept amusing in the way that a collector might find an ugly but valuable artifact amusing. Not beautiful, but worth keeping. During one training exercise, I accidentally headbutted a witch initiate who had expected me to dodge the way a Drukhari would by dropping low and spinning away. Instead, I panicked and lurched forward, and the crown of my skull connected with her nose at a velocity that surprised both of us. She stared at me in stunned silence for a full 3 seconds, blood streaming down her chin before she started laughing. It was, she told me later, the first time an opponent had ever surprised her with something that stupid. Sorvathi included the incident in her training notes under the heading Unpredictable Threat Vectors. I trained with the cult for 2 years, and by the end of that time I was capable of holding my own in a practice bout against a witch initiate, which does not sound impressive until you understand that a witch initiate has been training since birth, possesses reflexes 3 times faster than mine, and considers a practice bout in which no one is seriously injured to be a waste of everyone's time. I was never going to be a witch. I was never going to fight in the arenas. But I had learned to move with a precision and a fluidity that earned me, if not respect, then at least a reduction in the intensity of the contempt directed at me by the warriors of the Cabal. I had learned to be graceful, and in Commorragh, grace is the difference between a weapon and a decoration. It was during my training with the cult that Mervis began to deploy me in my first operational role within the Cabal. Not as a warrior, though my combat training had made me competent enough to defend myself in most situations. Not as a spy, though my unique status as a human who spoke fluent Drukhari and understood Commorragh culture from the inside gave me access to social spaces that no other human in the Dark City could penetrate. My role was something between the two. I was a translator, not of language, but of intent. Mervis used me as an instrument for interpreting human behavior during the planning and execution of real space raids, and it was in this capacity that I first left Commorragh and set foot on a world that existed under open sky. My first raid was against a world called Thessenwald, a minor hive world on the eastern fringe of the Imperium that had been identified by the Cabal's intelligence operatives as a promising target. The Planetary Defense Force was under strength. The local Imperial Guard garrison had been redeployed to deal with an orc incursion 3 systems away, and the civilian population was concentrated in a cluster of mid-tier hive cities that offered dense slave harvesting potential with minimal military resistance. Standard targeting parameters. A textbook operation, or so it seemed. The webway portal opened in the pre-dawn darkness of Thessenwald's northern hemisphere, and I stepped through it onto a world of stone and metal and cold, wet air. I remember the sky. I remember looking up and seeing the stars, real stars, not the harvested glow of imprisoned suns filtered through the crystalline walls of a webway pocket, but actual points of light scattered across an actual void, and feeling a sensation that was equal parts wonder and revulsion. The sky was too big, too open, too empty. There was nothing above me, no spires, no structures, no ceiling of any kind, just endless yawning darkness studded with distant fires. And I felt exposed in a way that I had never felt in Commorragh, where every direction is a wall and every wall is a weapon. I understood, in that moment, why the Drukhari prefer their enclosed and lightless realm. Open sky is a vulnerability. It is a direction from which threats can come that you cannot see or anticipate, and it offers nothing in return except a vertigo-inducing reminder of how insignificant you are in the scale of the cosmos. I did not enjoy Thessenwald. I did not enjoy the raid. I did not enjoy the screaming, or the running, or the sight of humans being herded into slave barges by Cabalite warriors, whose efficiency was matched only by their indifference to the suffering they were causing. I did not enjoy these things because I am not capable of enjoying them in the way a Drukhari does. I cannot feed on suffering. I cannot absorb the psychic residue of terror and convert it into sustenance. I can only witness it, and witnessing it without the ability to feed on it is, I have been told by Drukhari, who have experienced both states, a little like being in a room full of exquisite food while having no mouth. You can see it. You can smell it. You can understand intellectually why everyone around you is enraptured. But you cannot taste it, and the absence of that taste is its own kind of hunger. What I could do, and what I did, was advise. I stood beside the raid commander, a Draken named Velethis, who regarded my presence with the tight-lipped tolerance of a professional who has been told by their superior to use a tool they do not trust, and I interpreted. Not language, though I did occasionally translate intercepted Vox communications from Low Gothic into the Drukhari tongue. I interpreted behavior. I explained why the humans were retreating in the direction they were retreating, because they were heading for the cathedral district, where the local ecclesiarchy maintained a fortified compound, and where many citizens believed, incorrectly, that the Emperor's blessing would protect them from Xenos assault. I explained why a group of civilians was barricading themselves in a manufactorum rather than fleeing to open ground, because humans, when frightened, seek enclosed spaces, the opposite of the Drukhari instinct to seek mobility and elevation. I explained why a unit of PDF troopers had stopped retreating and turned to fight despite being outnumbered and outgunned because their commanding officer had invoked a concept that the Drukhari find difficult to translate, the concept of duty, of obligation to something larger than oneself that overrides the survival instinct and turns a frightened soldier into something slightly more dangerous than he was a moment ago. Velethis listened. She did not thank me, because Drukhari do not thank, but she adjusted her deployment accordingly, and the raid was completed with a 17% higher slave yield than initial projections had anticipated. I also correctly predicted that a group of humans would attempt to hide in a grain silo, despite the fact that grain silos are not, by any rational assessment, defensible positions. When I explained to Velethis that humans in crisis will frequently seek shelter in the nearest large structure regardless of its tactical value because the psychological need to have walls around them overrides their strategic thinking, she looked at me with an expression that I have come to interpret as a Drukhari, recognizing that a lesser species has said something genuinely useful and resenting the experience intensely. That number was reported to Mayor Vyse, who reported it to the court, and my stock within the Cabal rose by a measurable increment. I had proven my utility. In Commorragh, utility is protection. A useful thing is a thing that is kept. The raids continued. Over the following years, I participated in dozens of operations across Imperial space and beyond, each one adding to my understanding of the galaxy outside Commorragh, and each one reinforcing my value to the Cabal. I learned to read human settlements with the same eye a Drukhari scout brings to a battlefield, identifying defensive weaknesses and social pressure points, and the psychological fault lines that, when exploited, caused organized resistance to collapse into panic. I learned the military doctrine of the Imperial Guard, the tactical procedures of the Adeptus Arbites, the deployment patterns of the planetary defense forces that varied from world to world, but shared common structural assumptions that could be anticipated and countered. I became, in Mervisier's words, an investment that was beginning to pay returns. But it was not the military intelligence that made me truly valuable. It was the other thing. The thing that no one spoke about openly, but that everyone in the court understood. I could talk to the slaves. This sounds trivial, I know. The Drukhari have plenty of beings who can speak Low Gothic, or who can implant translation devices in their cortex, or who can simply torture the necessary information out of a captive without the inconvenience of linguistic barriers. But talking to someone is not the same as communicating with them, and communicating with someone is not the same as understanding them, and understanding someone is not the same as making them trust you. The Drukhari cannot make a human trust them. The gap between the species is too vast, the reputation too well-deserved, the terror too immediate and too absolute. But I could. I wore a human face. I spoke with a human voice. I could sit with a freshly captured slave and explain to them, in their own language, what was going to happen to them, and more importantly, I could explain it in a way that reduced their initial resistance. that channeled their fear into compliance rather than defiance, that made the processing of new arrivals smoother and more efficient and less costly in terms of damaged merchandise and Kabbalite casualties. I was, in essence, a tool for the management of livestock. I made the cattle come quietly to the slaughter, and I was very, very good at it. This is the part of my story where I expect you to hate me if you do not already. This is the part where the human in the audience, the person listening to this account with their human ears and their human heart and their human capacity for moral judgment, decides that I have crossed a line from victim to perpetrator, from captive to collaborator, from a tragic figure worthy of sympathy to a monster worthy of condemnation. And you may be right, I will not argue the point. I have argued it with myself enough times to know that there is no winning side. But I will ask you this: what would you have done if you had been born in the dark, if you had been raised by wolves and taught to hunt with the pack and fed at the kill and shown nothing of the world but the forest and the chase and the red, wet joy of the thing that wolves do? If you had never known any other life, if the wolves were the only family you had ever had, and the forest was the only home, and the hunting was the only purpose, would you have refused to hunt? Would you have turned on the pack? Would you have walked into the open country alone, knowing nothing of the world that lay beyond the tree line, knowing only that the forest, for all its dangers, was the place where you belonged? I hunted with the pack. I do not ask for forgiveness. I merely ask that you understand the shape of the cage, even if the cage has no bars. My position within the cabal of the Hollow Blade solidified over the years that followed, settling into something that had no official title but was understood by everyone who mattered. I was the Archon's instrument, her interpreter of the lesser species, her bridge between the razor-edged elegance of Commorragh thought and the blunt, emotional, frustratingly irrational architecture of the human mind. Marvies used me in her negotiations with other cabals, positioning me as a living demonstration of her sophistication and her willingness to innovate. She used me in her intelligence operations, deploying me to analyze captured documents and intercepted communications from imperial sources that her other operatives could translate, but not truly understand. She used me, increasingly, as a presence in her court, a fixture at her side during audiences and banquets, and the elaborate social engagements that are the primary battlefield of Commorragh politics. Because my existence at her table was a statement that no other Archon in High Commorragh could make. I have a Monkey who speaks the high tongue. I have a Monkey who understands the silent tongue. I have a Monkey who thinks like one of us, who was shaped by us, who is proof that we can take the lowest material in the galaxy and make something worth looking at. I attended a banquet once where a visiting Archon spent the entire evening trying to determine whether I was an actual human or an elaborate flesh construct designed to look like one, because the alternative, that a real Monkey was sitting at the table and participating in the conversation with competent use of the formal register, was apparently more disturbing to him than the possibility that his host had commissioned a particularly lifelike mannequin. When I sneezed, which is a biological function that the Drukhari do not share, he nearly fell out of his seat. Mervis told me later that the evening had been a complete success. This, naturally, made me a target. The first serious attempt on my life came when I was 22, and it was so elegantly constructed that I almost admired it, even as I was bleeding out on the floor of a secondary corridor in the Kai Thelane Spire. The assassin was a half-born named Thesivael, a low-ranking member of the court's administrative staff who had been recruited by a rival faction within the Cabal, a group of true-born traditionalists who viewed my elevation as an affront to the natural order, and who had been maneuvering for months to remove me without provoking a direct confrontation with the Archon. Thessavale approached me with a data slate containing what she said was an urgent intelligence report that required my analysis. And when I reached for the slate, she drove a splinter crystal stiletto into my side with a precision that suggested she had studied my anatomy in considerable detail. The blade slipped between two of the reinforced ribs that Gezrik had installed and punctured something important. I never learned exactly what, and I fell, and I bled. And Thessavael stood over me and watched me bleed with an expression of professional satisfaction that was, I later reflected, entirely appropriate for the situation. She should have finished me. That was her mistake. In Commorragh, you do not wound and then observe. You wound and then cut the throat, or you wound and then leave before anyone notices. But you do not stand over a dying enemy and savor the moment, because the moment is a luxury, and luxury has a cost. The cost, in Thessavael's case, was the 3 seconds she spent watching me die instead of making sure I was dead, which was exactly the time Thraven needed to come around the corner on his regular patrol of the secondary corridors and put a splinter round through her cervical spine. She dropped. I did not drop because I was already on the floor. Thraven, who had never liked me, who had called me a grox and an embarrassment, and worse things in languages I was only beginning to learn, picked me up and carried me to Gezrik's laboratory with a speed that suggested he valued my continued existence for reasons that transcended personal affection. He was right to do so. When Mare Vis learned of the attempt, the investigation she launched consumed the better part of a year, and by the time it was finished, the Trueborn faction that had orchestrated the assassination had been dismantled so thoroughly that the Spire's janitorial staff needed a full cycle to clean the results from the walls. 17 courtiers died. Their deaths were slow. I was invited to watch, and I watched, and I felt something that disturbed me more than the violence itself. I felt grateful. Not for the deaths, not exactly, but for what they represented. Mare Vis had expended significant political capital and considerable personal effort to avenge an insult to me, which meant that my value to her was not merely practical but personal, or so I believed. She cared about me, not in the human sense, not with the warm and unconditional warmth that I have been told characterizes human parental attachment, but in the Drukhari sense, which is deeper and more dangerous. Her care was a collector's care for a rare piece, possessive and fierce, tolerating no damage and no theft and no challenge to her ownership. It was not love by any definition that a human would recognize, but it was the closest thing to love that existed in my world, and I held onto it the way a drowning man holds onto a rope, not because the rope is comfortable, but because the alternative is the abyss. There were other attempts over the years, some overt, some subtle, some so oblique that I did not recognize them as attacks until long after the fact. A poisoned drink at a banquet that I avoided only because Gezrik's modifications had given me a sensitivity to certain toxins that manifested as a faint metallic taste on the back of my tongue. A structural failure in the corridor outside my quarters that was later traced to a deliberately compromised support beam. An invitation to a social function hosted by a cabal that I had never heard of, in a district of Low Commorragh that I had never visited, which turned out to be an ambush that I survived only because Thraven, who had by this point been assigned as my permanent security detail on what I was told were Mare Vis's orders, had enough combat experience to recognize a kill zone when he walked into one and enough firepower to walk back out. Each attempt reinforced the same lesson. I was valuable, I was resented, and the distance between those two states was the distance between life and death, and it was measured in the Archon's willingness to spend resources on my protection. I developed what I can only describe as a connoisseur's appreciation for the attempts on my life. The poisoned drink was amateurish but showed initiative. The structural failure was creative but lacked commitment to the follow-through. The ambush in Low Commorragh was genuinely well orchestrated, and I occasionally find myself wishing I could have complimented the planners before Thraven killed them. In Commorragh, a truly elegant assassination attempt is something between a threat and a love letter, and the fact that people kept sending them meant, in a perverse way, that I mattered enough to kill. I survived. I always survived. And each survival added another layer to the story of Caervon, the Archon's pet, the Monkey, who would not die, until the story itself became a kind of armor, a reputation that preceded me and that made each subsequent assassination attempt slightly more expensive and slightly less likely to be undertaken by anyone without significant resources and a very good reason. It was this reputation, this accumulation of survived catastrophes and demonstrated utility that led to the event that I consider the defining moment of my life before the revelation. The event that made me, in the eyes of the Dark City, something more than a curiosity. Mervis put me in the arena. Not as a fighter, though the distinction was largely academic, since the arena makes no formal distinction between combatants and decoration once the gates are sealed. She put me in the arena as a statement, the most extravagant and public statement she had ever made about my status within the Cabal. The occasion was the Festival of Shattered Veils, a bicentennial celebration of the founding of the Cult of the Bleeding Grace. And the cult had invited the most prestigious cabals of High Commorragh to participate in a collaborative spectacle. Each cabal was expected to contribute a champion or a team to fight in a multi-stage arena event, and the contribution itself was a form of political messaging. Sending your best warrior said one thing. Sending expendable cannon fodder said another. Sending a human being who had been trained by both Kabbalite weapon masters and witch instructors, who wore armor crafted in the forges of the Kythalane Spire, who carried weapons modified by the hand of a homunculus of the Flensed Choir, said something that had never been said before in the history of the Dark City. I looked at Mervis when she told me. I was 29 years old, which is, by Drukhari standards, barely old enough to be noticed. I had been living in Commorragh for nearly 3 decades, and in that time I had survived more than most half-born Drukhari survive in their first century. I was not afraid of the arena. I was afraid of what failing in the arena would mean for her, for the Cabal, for the statement she was making with my life. She saw the fear, of course. She could read me better than anyone alive, better even than Gezrik, because she had been reading me since before I could speak. And she said something to me that I have held close ever since, turning it over in my mind like a gem held up to the light, examining it from every angle, searching for the flaw that I know must be there, but that I have never been able to find. She said that she did not put me in the arena to prove something to the Dark City. She put me in the arena to prove something to me. She said that I had spent my entire life being told what I was not. Not Drukhari. Not fast enough, not strong enough, not sharp enough, not worthy of the seat I occupied, or the name I bore, or the air I breathed. She said that the arena would tell me what I was, not what others believed I was. What I actually was, stripped of context and expectation, and the 1,000 layers of social performance that Commorragh life demanded. In the arena, she said, there is only the fighter and the fight, and the truth of both is written in blood that cannot lie. I believed her. Of course I believed her. She was the center of my universe, the fixed point around which everything in my life revolved, and when she spoke, the words entered my mind with the force of law. I did not question her motivation. I did not wonder whether there were other reasons, political reasons, strategic reasons that had nothing to do with my personal growth and everything to do with the complex web of alliances and rivalries that she navigated every day. I trusted her. I trusted her with the absolute, unquestioning trust of a child who has never been given a reason to doubt. And that trust was the foundation of everything I was, and it would, in time, become the instrument of everything I lost. The arena was everything and nothing like I expected. I will not describe the fights in detail because the details are not the point, and because the specific sequence of attacks and counterattacks and tactical decisions that constituted my performance in the crucible of the Bleeding Grace would be meaningless to anyone who was not there to see them. What matters is that I fought and I survived, and I did not merely survive but performed with a competence that surprised even Sorvathi, who was watching from the cult's private gallery with an expression that several witnesses described as very nearly approaching something that was not quite identical to, but was in the general vicinity of satisfaction. I killed 3 opponents. The first was an orc, a large and angry specimen that had been released into the arena as a warm-up for the crowd, and I dispatched it with a combination of Thraven's doctrine of the single wound and Sorvathi's teaching of fluid evasion that left the creature dead before it understood what had happened. The second was a human, a captured Imperial Guard sergeant, who had been armed and armored and set loose in the arena with the promise that he would be freed if he survived, a promise that both he and I knew was a lie. He fought well for a human. He fought with the desperate courage of a man who has nothing left except the fight itself, and when I put my blade through his throat, I felt a moment of something that I did not identify until much later. Not guilt, not regret, something older and more fundamental, a recognition of shared substance, of blood meeting blood, of the fact that the man I had just killed was, at the most basic biological level, the same thing as me, and that in killing him I had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. The third opponent was a Drukhari, a half-born warrior from a rival cabal who had been selected by his Archon as a disposable piece in the same political game that Mervis was playing with me. He was faster than me. He was stronger than me. He was better than me in every measurable way. But he did not understand me, and he made the mistake that Sorvathi had warned me every Drukhari opponent would eventually make. He assumed I would behave like a Drukhari, because I moved like one, and I thought like one, and I fought like one. And when I did not, when I did something irrational and unpredictable and entirely irreducibly human, he was not prepared for it. I took a wound that a Drukhari would never have accepted, a deep cut across my forearm that should have caused me to drop my weapon. And instead of dropping it, I tightened my grip and drove forward into the space his attack had opened, inside his guard, inside his reach, so close that I could see the surprise in his eyes in the fraction of a second before my blade found his heart. The crowd erupted, not with the refined, aesthetically modulated appreciation that the Drukhari typically bring to arena spectacles, but with something raw and louder and more honest, shock perhaps, or novelty, or the sheer disorienting pleasure of seeing something that none of them had ever seen before, a human being, a Monkey, standing over the body of a Drukhari warrior in the arena of the Bleeding Grace, covered in blood that was not entirely his own, alive when every calculation said he should be dead. Mervis was standing on her balcony when I looked up, and the expression on her face was the same expression she had worn when she watched me watch the arena for the first time. That complex, layered, impossible to fully interpret expression that I had spent years learning to read. Satisfaction, vindication, and that other thing, that thing I had always called pride. I still called it pride. I would continue calling it pride for another 7 years, until the night I descended into Gesrick's laboratory without permission and found the records that told me what it actually was. I need to explain why I went there. The reason matters, because it is the kind of reason that makes sense only in the context of a life lived in Commorragh, where curiosity is both a survival trait and a terminal illness, and where the line between intelligent inquiry and suicidal recklessness is thinner than a splinter round. I went to Grimdark's laboratory because I was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, not in the way that a warrior dies on a blade or a slave dies on the rack. I was dying the way all humans die, slowly and quietly and by degrees, and Grimdark's modifications, for all their sophistication, had not stopped the process so much as decelerated it. I was 36 years old. In human terms, this was the beginning of middle age, the start of the long, slow slide toward the inevitable terminus that awaits every member of my species. In Drukhari terms, I was a child. Mervis was old enough to remember events that had occurred before my home planet had been colonized, and Grimdark was older still, old enough that the question of his age had become, in his own words, aesthetically irrelevant. By their standards, I was a candle flame, bright for a moment and then gone. I had begun to notice the signs, small things at first, a slight stiffness in my joints that had not been there a year ago, a marginal decrease in my reaction time during training exercises, a fatigue that settled into my muscles after exertion and took slightly longer to dissipate than it once had. These were not significant impairments. A human physician would have told me that I was in excellent health, that the changes I was experiencing were normal and expected and nothing to be concerned about. But I was not living among human physicians. I was living among beings who did not age, who could be regrown from fragments, who measured their lives in millennia rather than decades. And in that context, the first whisper of physical decline was not a minor inconvenience. It was a countdown. I wanted to understand what Grimdark had done to me. I wanted to know the full extent of his modifications, the projected lifespan of his work, the parameters within which my enhanced biology would continue to function before the underlying human substrate began to degrade beyond the capacity of his repairs to compensate. I wanted, in short, to know how much time I had. I had asked Grimdark directly on multiple occasions, and each time he had deflected with the practiced evasiveness of a being who considers questions to be an intrusion and answers to be a weapon that should never be given freely. He told me that my condition was being monitored, that my progress was satisfactory, that I should not concern myself with variables that were beyond my capacity to influence. These are the things that a doctor says to a patient they do not trust with the truth. And I recognized the pattern because I had been raised in a culture that elevates deception to an art form. So I went to find the truth myself. I descended to the laboratory during a period when Grimdark was known to be away from the spire, attending a conclave of the Flensed Choir in the deep sub-realms of the Webway. I bypassed the security protocols on his laboratory door, using a technique that Thraven had taught me years ago for an entirely different purpose, and I entered the space where I had been measured and modified and refined over the course of 2 decades, and I began to search. The records were not hidden. That is the thing that strikes me most, looking back. They were not encrypted or secured or stored in a locked vault behind layers of counter-intrusion measures. They were simply filled, catalogued and organized with the same meticulous precision that Grimdark brought to everything in his laboratory, stored in a data crystal archive that was accessible from any terminal in the room. He had not hidden them because it had never occurred to him that I would look. I was, after all, his subject, his specimen, his project, and specimens do not browse the researcher's notes. The cattle do not read the farmer's ledger. But I read it. I read all of it, and the process of reading took most of the night, and by the time I finished, the false dawn had shifted through its cycle, and the spire was beginning to stir with the routines of a new day. And I was sitting on the floor of the laboratory with the data crystal in my lap, and a sensation in my chest that was not pain exactly, but the place where pain begins, the hollow before the hurt, the intake of breath before the scream. The project was called The Cultivation. That was its name in the Flensed Choir's internal records, a formal designation used in reports and correspondence between Gesric and his colleagues in the Coven. And reading it in the clinical, detached language of homunculus documentation gave it a quality of unreality that made it simultaneously easier and harder to process. The cultivation was a long-term experiment in the refinement of psychic essence, designed to test a hypothesis that Gesric had formulated over 3 centuries before my birth, and that he had been waiting for the right subject to test ever since. The hypothesis was this: the psychic essence produced by suffering is not uniform. It varies in quality and potency depending on a number of factors, including the intensity of the suffering, the duration of the suffering, the psychological resilience of the subject, and, critically, the depth and complexity of the emotional attachments that the suffering disrupts. A slave who is tortured produces essence of a certain quality. A slave who is tortured after being given hope produces essence of a higher quality. A slave who is tortured after being given genuine happiness, authentic belonging, real love, produces essence of a quality so refined and so potent that it transcends the ordinary spectrum of psychic sustenance entirely and enters a category that Gesric described in his notes as the exquisite. The exquisite, that was his word for it. The exquisite suffering of a soul that has been given everything and then had everything taken away, not by accident, not by misfortune, but by design. The suffering of a being who discovers that their entire life, every kindness they received, and every attachment they formed, and every moment of joy and belonging and love was an investment. A careful, methodical, centuries in the planning investment in the eventual destruction of their inner world. The suffering of a being who learns that they were loved, not because they were worthy of love, but because their love was a resource to be harvested, and that the harvest cannot occur until the love is genuine, and that the fact that the love is genuine is precisely what makes the harvest worth waiting for. I was the subject, but I was not the first. The records went back over 300 years. Gesric had attempted the cultivation 6 times before me, each iteration refining the methodology, each failure teaching him something new about the parameters of the experiment. The first subject was a human child taken from a feral world in M39, placed with a minor cabal in the middle tiers of Commorragh. The child lasted 9 years before a psychotic break rendered the emotional landscape too fragmented to be of use. Gesric's notes on this failure were terse and clinical: insufficient environmental stability, hosting cabal unable to maintain consistent nurturing protocols, subject degraded, discarded. The second lasted longer, 14 years, raised in the household of a succubus who found the novelty of a human ward temporarily amusing. That subject killed itself, jumped from a spire bridge into the chasms of Low Commorragh after discovering, through the casual cruelty of a witch sparring partner, that its entire existence was a source of entertainment rather than a matter of genuine regard. Gesric's notes on this one were more detailed, more frustrated. Premature revelation through uncontrolled variable. Emotional collapse exceeded recovery parameters. Total loss. The third subject survived to adulthood, but never formed attachments of sufficient depth, producing what Gesric dismissed as essence of middling quality, barely distinguishable from conventional torture yield. He attributed this to the subject's native psychological resilience, which he characterized as an undesirable trait in future candidates. The fourth was compromised by a rival coven that discovered the experiment and destroyed the subject to deny Gesric his yield. The fifth showed extraordinary promise for 22 years before the hosting Archon was assassinated in an unrelated power struggle, destabilizing the nurturing environment and corrupting the attachment structures beyond salvage. I was the sixth, the one that worked. And reading the notes on my predecessors, I understood something that made the cultivation even more terrible than I had initially grasped. Each failure had been incorporated into the design of the next attempt. Each dead child, each broken mind, each discarded specimen had contributed data that made my experience more precisely calibrated, more carefully controlled, more exquisitely effective. The love I received was not just engineered, it was iterated. It was the sixth draft of a document that had been revised and refined through 3 centuries of trial and error, and each revision had been written in the suffering of someone who had come before me and been found wanting. I was standing on a foundation of corpses, and the corpses were children, and they had been just like me. The records also corrected the story of my origin. The version I had been told, the version I had believed for 36 years, was that the Archon of the Cabal of the Drawn Vein had found me by chance during a routine raid and gifted me to Mervis as a spontaneous gesture of diplomatic creativity. This was a lie, not a half-truth, not a selective omission, not the kind of artful reframing that the Drukhari employ when they wish to obscure without technically deceiving. A complete, structural, load-bearing lie upon which the entire narrative of my life had been constructed. The Archon of the Drawn Vein, a creature whose name I now know was Colvith Draneus, had been a client of the Flencid Choir for decades. Gesserik had commissioned the infant specifically. The raid on Palingrath IV had been selected not for its slave yield or its strategic value, but because Gesserik's intelligence operatives had identified the world as a source of psychically compatible human genetic stock, and the warrior who pulled me from the Burning Hab unit had been briefed in advance on exactly what to look for. An infant, healthy, quiet, young enough that no pre-existing attachments or traumas would contaminate the blank canvas. The warrior had not found me by accident. He had been sent to collect me. The entire gift-giving ceremony in the reception hall of the Caithelane Spire, the careful theatrics of surprise and amusement, and the Archon's seemingly spontaneous decision to keep me, all of it was choreography. A performance staged for the benefit of the court, so that the origin story would embed itself in the collective memory of the Cabal and become part of the mythology that surrounded me. The charming tale of the Archon's whim, the lucky infant, the pet that became a person. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was ever left to chance. From the moment I was pulled from the fire, I was walking a path that had been laid down for me 300 years before my birth. Gesserik had spent 36 years writing a pattern of exquisite complexity and exquisite beauty, a pattern of belonging and purpose and love that was designed from the very first stroke to be destroyed. Mervis knew. The records were clear on this point. The Archon had been a participant in the cultivation from the beginning, a collaborator who had agreed to Gesserik's proposal in exchange for a share of the eventual yield. Her treatment of me, her kindness, her protection, her willingness to elevate me above my station and defend me against those who sought to harm me, all of it was real in the sense that it had actually happened, and all of it was false in the sense that it had been performed with a specific outcome in mind. She had played the role of the caring patron, the protector, the closest thing I had to a parent, and she had played it well because the role was not entirely a role. That was the genius of Gesserik's design. He did not ask Mervis to pretend to care about me. He asked her to actually care about me within the parameters of what a Drukhari is capable of caring, because the experiment required authenticity. It required that my emotional attachments be real, not simulated. Because simulated attachments produce simulated suffering, and simulated suffering is worthless. So she cared about me. She cared about me the way a vintner cares about a grape, attentively, knowledgeably, with an expert understanding of the conditions required to produce the desired result, and with the certain knowledge that the grape's ultimate destiny is to be crushed. But there was a complication. Buried deeper in the archive, in a series of encrypted personal notes that Gesric had apparently not intended for the Coven's general records, I found something that stopped me cold, a secondary thread of documentation spanning the last 12 years that read less like the detached observations of a researcher and more like the increasingly agitated correspondence of a man who suspects his instrument has developed a will of its own. Gesric was worried about Mervis. Not worried in the abstract, strategic sense that a homunculus worries about external threats to an experiment, but worried in a specific, targeted, almost panicked way that was startling to encounter in the notes of a being who had lived for millennia and who prided himself on his emotional equilibrium. The concern was this. The Archon's attachment to the subject was exceeding projected parameters. Mervis was not merely playing the role of the nurturing patron. She was inhabiting it. She was protecting me with a vehemence that went beyond the requirements of the cultivation, expending political capital and personal risk at levels that Gesric's models had not predicted and could not account for. The assassination attempts that I had survived were supposed to be part of the process, controlled variables that would deepen my sense of belonging by demonstrating the Archon's willingness to defend me. But Mervis's responses to those attempts had been disproportionate. The 17 courtiers she had killed after Thesivile's attack on me was 7 more than Gesrec had calculated as the optimal response. The investigation she had launched was 3 times more thorough than the experiment required. She was, in Gesric's precise and clinical terminology, over-investing in the subject's emotional security at the expense of the cultivation's long-term yield curve. There was a note, dated approximately 8 years before my discovery, that I read 4 times before I was sure I was understanding it correctly. Gesric had requested a meeting with Mervis to discuss what he called recalibration of the nurturing protocols, a polite way of telling the Archon that she needed to pull back, to moderate her attachment, to remember that the purpose of the exercise was not my happiness, but my eventual devastation. Mervis had refused the meeting. She had not merely declined. She had sent Gesric a response, quoted verbatim in his notes, that consisted of a single sentence in the High Tongue. Translated loosely, it said that the homunculus should concern himself with his instruments and leave the Archon to manage her own affairs. Gesric had interpreted this as a troubling sign. A subject whose caretaker develops genuine emotional investment beyond experimental parameters presents a risk variable, he wrote. If the attachment becomes authentic rather than performed, the caretaker may resist the harvest phase. Contingency protocols are being developed. I did not know what to do with this information. I still do not. Because if Gesric was right, if Mervis's attachment to me had grown beyond the boundaries of the experiment, then one of 2 things was true. Either the Archon was a better performer than even a 3 centuries experienced homunculus could detect, in which case the entire concept of authentic attachment was meaningless, and everything I had ever believed about the relationship was a lie, even deeper than the cultivation itself. Or else something had happened that neither Gesric nor Mervis had anticipated. Something had grown in the space between the performance and the person performing it. Something real and unplanned and potentially dangerous to the experiment, and the reason I could not decide which possibility was true was that both of them hurt in exactly the same way and for exactly the same reason. Because even if the love was real, it had still been born from a lie. And a flower that grows from poisoned soil is still beautiful, but you cannot eat it without dying. I sat on the floor of the laboratory and I read the projected timeline. Gesric had originally planned the harvest for my 50th year, which he calculated would be the optimal intersection of emotional maturity, attachment depth, and remaining physical vitality. The harvest would involve a systematic dismantling of every attachment and every identity structure that had been built over the course of my life, conducted with the same precision and patience that had characterized their construction. First, the stripping of status, the public removal of my position in the court, the revocation of my privileges, the reassignment from honored instrument to common slave. Then the stripping of relationship, the withdrawal of Mervis's attention, the dissolution of every bond I had formed within the Cabal, the systematic isolation of a being who had been raised in the warmth of belonging until the warmth was all they knew. And finally, the stripping of self, the revelation of the truth, delivered not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, methodical, exquisitely calibrated sequence of discoveries, each one building on the last, each one eroding another layer of the identity I had built, until there was nothing left but the raw, screaming core of a being who had just learned that everything they are is a lie. The projected yield, according to Gesric's calculations, would be sufficient to sustain the coven of the Flensed Choir for decades. The Archon's share would sustain her court for longer. The essence of the exquisite, he wrote, is the most concentrated form of psychic sustenance ever documented, exceeding the yield of conventional torture by a factor of magnitude that makes comparison meaningless. I was a crop. I had always been a crop, and I was approaching the season of my harvest. I put the data crystal back where I found it. I left the laboratory. I returned to my quarters in the upper spire, and I sat on the edge of my sleeping platform, and I looked at the crystalline walls that caught the stolen light of the captive sun, and I felt the thing that Gesric had spent 36 years cultivating inside me come alive and begin to bloom. It was everything he had predicted. It was everything he had hoped for. The suffering was extraordinary. It was a suffering that had no parallel in my experience, not the pain of Gesric's modifications, or the fear of assassination attempts, or the hollow loneliness of being the only one of my kind in a city of millions. This was a suffering that attacked the foundations of identity itself, that took everything I believed about myself and my place in the world, and my relationship with the beings I loved, and recast it in a light so harsh and so unforgiving that every familiar shape became a stranger. I had been loved. The love had been real. The love had also been a weapon, forged over decades, aimed at my heart, waiting for the moment of its deployment. And the worst part, the part that Gesric had calculated with a precision that bordered on prophecy, was that knowing the truth did not change the love. I could not stop loving them. I could not stop loving Mervis, who had raised me and protected me, and played the role of my mother with a conviction that was either the most masterful performance in the history of Commorragh or something else entirely. Something that the Drukhari do not have a word for because they have never needed one. I could not stop loving Commorragh, the dark and terrible city that had shaped me, the only home I had ever known, the place that was simultaneously my cradle and my casket. I could not stop loving the life I had lived, even though I now knew that the life was a work of art, and I was the canvas and the paint and the intended audience all at once. You cannot unlearn love. That is the cruelty of it. You can learn that the love was engineered. You can learn that every act of kindness was a calculated investment. You can read the research notes and see the yield projections and understand, with absolute clarity, that you were cultivated like a rare orchid, not for your own sake, but for the sake of the bloom. And you will still love the hand that watered you. You will still turn toward the light. That is the exquisite. That is what Gesric was farming. Not the suffering itself, but the impossibility of its resolution. The suffering of a being who cannot stop loving the ones who designed its destruction, because the love is real, and real things cannot be undone by knowledge. I considered my options. This is what the Drukhari in me did, while the human in me was still sitting on the edge of the sleeping platform, staring at a wall and trying to remember how to breathe. The Drukhari in me, the part that Myrvis had built and Kelvassian had educated, and Threevin had hardened and Sorvathi had sharpened, that part began to calculate. It weighed variables. It assessed threats. It projected outcomes across multiple timelines and evaluated each one with the cold, surgical pragmatism that 36 years in Commorragh had drilled into my neural architecture, the way Grimdark had drilled reinforcing compounds into my bones. Option 1. Flee. Leave Commorragh. Escape into the webway, find a portal to real space, and disappear into the vast anonymity of the Imperium, where a single human being can vanish like a drop of water in an ocean. This option was theoretically possible and practically suicidal. I did not know the webway. I did not have access to a portal. I did not have allies outside the Cabal, and every ally inside the Cabal was, by definition, complicit in the cultivation, either knowingly or as an unwitting participant in an experiment they did not understand. And even if I somehow managed to reach real space, what then? I did not know how to be human. I did not know imperial customs or imperial law or the 1,000 small social rituals that allow a human being to exist within imperial society without being identified as an outsider and reported to the authorities. I spoke Low Gothic with an accent that any native speaker would immediately recognize as wrong. I thought in a language that had no human equivalent. I was, in every way that mattered, a Drukhari, trapped in a human body, and the Imperium does not treat kindly with those who bear the mark of Xenos corruption. I would be detained. I would be interrogated. I would be executed, or worse, handed over to the Inquisition, whose methods of extracting information from suspected Xenos collaborators make Grimdark's work look like a therapeutic massage. Option 2. Confront Myrvis. Tell her that I knew. Demand an explanation, an apology, a renegotiation of the terms of my existence. This option was not suicidal so much as delusional, and I say this as someone who once headbutted a witch in the face and considered it a valid tactical choice. Confronting an Archon with evidence of their own scheme is not a negotiating tactic. It is a declaration that you have outlived your usefulness as a subject and are now ready to be harvested ahead of schedule. Myrvis would not apologize. Myrvis would not renegotiate. Myrvis would look at me with those ancient, beautiful, terrible eyes, and she would calculate, just as I was calculating. And she would determine that a subject who knows the truth is a subject whose suffering has already begun to peak, and that the optimal response to a premature peak is an accelerated harvest. Option 3. Confront Grimdark. This was marginally less suicidal than confronting Myrvis, in the sense that Grimdark was not a political animal and did not typically resolve interpersonal conflicts through assassination. He resolved them through modification. A subject who had become difficult could be made less difficult through the judicious application of neurochemical adjustments. And a subject who had discovered the truth of the cultivation could be made to forget it through techniques that the coven of the Flensed Choir had perfected over millennia of practice. Grimdark could reach into my mind and remove the knowledge like a surgeon removing a tumor, excising the memory of the records and the understanding they had produced, and leaving behind a clean, smooth blankness that would heal over and be forgotten. He could reset me to the state I had been in before the discovery, and the cultivation could continue on its original timeline, and I would never know the difference. The thought of that, the thought of losing the truth, was more terrifying than the truth itself. Option 4. Do nothing. Continue as before. Go to sleep, wake up, dress in the finery of the Archon's court, take my place at the table, perform my role, live my life, and carry the knowledge of the cultivation inside me like a blade swallowed whole, its edge cutting deeper with every breath but never quite deep enough to kill. Pretend that nothing had changed. Pretend that the love was still just love, that the kindness was still just kindness, that the woman who raised me was still just the woman who raised me, and not a collaborator in the most elaborate and most personal act of cruelty that the Dark City had ever devised. I chose option 4. I chose it because it was the most Drukhari option available, and because I am, despite everything, despite the biology and the blood and the face in the mirror that will never be anything but human, a product of this place. The Drukhari survive by adaptation. They survive by incorporating new information into existing frameworks without allowing it to destabilize the structures they depend on. They survive by being what the moment requires them to be, and the moment required me to be what I had always been. The Archon's instrument, the cable's translator, the Monkey who had been given a name and a seat and a purpose, the crop that was not yet ripe. That was 3 years ago. I have been living with the knowledge for 3 years now, and each day is an exercise in a form of discipline that no tutor ever taught me and no combat instructor ever prepared me for. The discipline of endurance without resolution. The discipline of carrying a wound that cannot heal because healing it would require removing the blade, and removing the blade would mean losing the only thing I have left that is entirely and authentically mine. The truth. The ugly, devastating, liberating truth of what I am and what I was made for. I still sit at Mayavis's table. I still advise the raid commanders. I still translate the screaming of freshly captured slaves into actionable intelligence for the Cabal's processing operations. I still train with Thraven, and that is perhaps the hardest performance of all. Thraven, who taught me the doctrine of the single wound. Thraven, who carried me bleeding to Gesric's laboratory after Thesivael's blade found my ribs. Thraven, who was assigned as my security detail and who saved my life in the ambush in Low Commorragh, and who called me a grox and an embarrassment, and who was, I had believed, the closest thing I had to a relationship uncomplicated by the Archon's politics. A warrior's bond, a grudging, unspoken, mutually disowned respect between two beings who trained together and bled together and survived together. I valued it more than I ever admitted because it was the one connection in my life that seemed to exist outside the machinery of the court, a thing that had grown organically from shared experience rather than being engineered from above. Gesric's records destroyed that too. Thraven's assignment as my protector had not come from Mervis. It had come from the coven of the Flensed Choir, purchased with the only currency that makes a Kabbalite warrior answer to a homunculus without resentment, the promise of priority resurrection should he fall in battle. A guaranteed return from death, free of charge, no questions asked, no soul portion owed. That is what my friendship was worth. One standing reservation on a regeneration sarcophagus. He was not a bodyguard, he was a custodian, a keeper tasked with ensuring the physical security of the investment and reporting on my emotional state, my behavioral patterns, my attachment development, directly to Gesric at regular intervals. The reports were in the archive, dozens of them, filed chronologically, each one written in Thraven's terse, military shorthand, and each one containing observations about me that demonstrated a level of attentiveness I had mistaken for the quiet vigilance of a soldier watching his charge. Subject displayed distress response after exposure to slave processing facility. Recommend monitoring for empathic deviation. Subject performed above projections in arena engagement. Emotional confidence markers elevated. Attachment to Archon deepening on expected trajectory. He had been watching me the way Gezrik watched me. Not with a warrior's respect, but with a technician's clipboard. Every insult, every reluctant compliment, every moment of shared silence after a hard training session had been observed and catalogued and submitted for analysis. The bond I had valued was data. The respect I had imagined was surveillance. I still train with him. I still accept his insults with equanimity. I look him in the eye and I spar with him and I let him correct my form and I give absolutely nothing away. Because the moment I flinch, the moment I pull back, the moment my behavior deviates from the established baseline by even a fraction, Thraven will file a report, and Gezrik will read it, and the harvest will accelerate. So I train, I absorb the insults, I perform the bond. And inside, where no one's instruments can reach, I note the particular cruelty of an experiment that did not merely manufacture my love, but also manufactured the only friendship I ever thought I had. I still descend to Gezrik's laboratory for my regular maintenance sessions, sitting in the same chair where I was first measured as a child, submitting to the same scans and the same calibrations, and the same careful, methodical, almost loving attention to the details of my modified physiology. Last session, he told me that my liver function had improved by 3%, and that he was pleased with the results. I thanked him because that is what you do when the man who is fattening you for slaughter tells you that you are fattening nicely. I look into those bioluminescent eyes, and I see the craftsman examining his work, and I say nothing. I give nothing away. I am the perfect subject, performing the role of the unaware with a conviction that would impress even Mervis, because I learned from the best. I learned from a woman who played the role of my mother for 36 years without ever once breaking character, and if she could sustain that performance, then I can sustain mine. But there is a difference between her performance and mine, and it is the difference that keeps me alive in a way that the cultivation never intended. She performed her role because the role served her purpose. I perform mine because the performance is the only form of resistance available to me. Every day that I maintain the pretense, every day that I sit at the table and smile, and speak the high tongue and wear the finery, and play the part of the Archon's beloved pet, I am denying Gezrik his harvest. Not because I am not suffering. I am suffering. The suffering is constant and profound, and exactly as exquisite as his projections predicted. But I am suffering on my own terms, at my own pace, in my own way, and I am not giving it to them. I am holding it inside me, every drop, every tremor, every moment of anguish and betrayal, and the love that will not die no matter how many times I drive a blade through its heart, and I am keeping it. It is mine. The only thing in my entire life that was not given to me by someone who intended to take it back. Gezrik's timeline calls for the harvest at 50. That gives me 11 years. 11 years of this. 11 years of sitting across from the woman who raised me and loving her and hating her and knowing that the two feelings are not opposites, but twins, born from the same source, nourished by the same history, inseparable and irreconcilable and permanent. 11 years of watching the false sun rise over the spires of high Commorragh and knowing that the light is stolen and the warmth is artificial and the beauty is a mask over a machine designed to convert living souls into fuel and loving it anyway. Loving it with a ferocity that frightens me sometimes, a possessive, desperate, irrational love that clings to every razor-edged surface of this monstrous city as though the clinging itself is the point. And perhaps it is. Perhaps that is what the Drukhari never understood about humans, not our weakness, not our fragility, not our laughably brief lifespans, or our dull senses, or our plodding, gravity-bound bodies. What they never understood is our capacity to love things that destroy us, and to find in that destruction something that looks, from certain angles, in certain light, remarkably like meaning. I have thought about what will happen when the harvest comes. Gesrick's notes are thorough, but they are not omniscient. They account for the variables that a homunculus can measure, the neurochemical responses, the physiological markers of emotional distress, the projected duration and intensity of the suffering that each phase of the dismantling will produce. They do not account for the variable that I represent, a subject who knows, a crop that is aware of the harvester, a being who has spent years preparing for the moment of its destruction, not by hardening itself against the pain, but by understanding the pain so thoroughly, so intimately, so completely that the pain has become a part of it, woven into the fabric of its daily existence, until the distinction between the suffering and the self has dissolved entirely. When the harvest comes, Gesserit expects to find a reservoir of untapped anguish, a dam of carefully accumulated psychic energy waiting to burst. What he will find instead is a well that has already been drunk. Not by him, not by Marvis, by me. I have been consuming my own suffering for 3 years, processing it, integrating it, using it as the raw material for the only thing I have ever built that is entirely my own, myself. The real self, not the one they designed, not the one they cultivated, but the one that grew in the space between the design and the truth. The self that knows what it is and what it was made for and has chosen, with full knowledge and full agency, to continue existing anyway. Or so I tell myself. The truth is that I have no idea whether a soul can metabolize its own anguish, or whether that is something I invented to make the nights bearable. Gesrick would probably find the hypothesis amusing. He might even want to study it. I do not know whether this will work. I do not know whether a depleted reservoir will register as a failure in Gesrick's instruments, or whether the suffering I have already processed will simply regenerate when the formal dismantling begins. I do not know whether the 11 years I have left will be enough to drain the well completely, or whether there will always be more, bubbling up from some inexhaustible source deep in the architecture of my human heart that the homunculus identified and targeted with such precision. I do not know whether what I am doing constitutes defiance or just a more elaborate form of compliance, a subject who has incorporated the knowledge of the experiment into the experiment itself, enriching the dataset even as he imagines he is corrupting it. But I know this. I know that I am still here. I know that I wake every morning in the upper spire of the Caith Thelane, and I look at the crystalline walls, and I see the stolen light, and I feel the hum of the anti-gravitational generators and the distant rhythm of the flesh engines below. And I know what all of it means, and I choose to stay. Not because I have no other option, not because I am afraid of the alternatives, but because this is my home. Commorragh is my home. The dark, the cruelty, the beauty, the hunger, the endless, intricate, magnificent horror of it. It is mine. I was made here. I was shaped here. I was cultivated here, yes, like a crop, like a specimen, like a vintage of suffering aged to perfection in the cellars of a monster's laboratory. And I was loved here, and the love was real even though its purpose was not, and I will not leave. I will not leave because leaving would mean that they were right, that I was only what they made me, that the shape of me was entirely their design, every thought and every feeling and every attachment a thread in the tapestry they wove, and that the tapestry could be unraveled at their convenience and the threads repurposed for their use. Leaving would be the final validation of the cultivation. It would prove that I was, in the end, exactly what Gesrick's notes predicted. A subject, a specimen, a crop. Staying is the only argument I have against that conclusion. staying and knowing and suffering and choosing to suffer, not because the suffering serves their purpose, but because the choice serves mine. I am a human being who lives in Commorragh. I was raised by the Drukhari. I was shaped by their hands and their language, and their cruelty, and their impossible, devastating, annihilating love. And I am still here. I am still here, and I am watching the stolen sun rise over the spires, and I am loving every terrible inch of this city that was built on the screams of billions. And I am holding inside me a suffering so exquisite that a homunculus spent 3 centuries designing the instrument to produce it, and I am not giving it to them. That is my defiance. That is my victory. A small and bitter and probably futile victory won in silence, celebrated by no one, visible to no audience. A human victory which is the only kind I am equipped to win. Not the grand, dramatic, galaxy-shaking victory of an imperial hero, or a space marine, or a saint whose name will be written in the records of the ecclesiarchy and spoken with reverence by billions. A quiet victory, a private one. The victory of a being who was grown to be consumed, and who has chosen, instead, to consume himself. To take the suffering that was meant for their table and eat it raw, every day, alone, in the stolen light of a captive sun, and call it breakfast. My name is Carvone. I am a human being. I live in the Dark City, and I am not finished yet.